What's up guys, it's Mitch here from the DIYRecordingstudio.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at part 3 of the build for the OLA5 Opto Compressor from DIY Recording Equipment. So welcome back to the channel guys. This is part 3 and the final build video for the OLA5 Opto Compressor. It's been an awesome build video series so far, but if you've missed part 1, I'll put a link right up here. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit like and subscribe down below. And if you have any questions about the gear I'm using or this compressor or anything else, make sure you hit me up in those comment sections down below. But that's enough from me. Let's get into the build. So welcome back to the channel guys, and first up today we're going to be looking at the daughter board, and the daughter board basically attaches to the main PCB board or motherboard, and it'll house most of the components that operate the LEDs, and it'll be in bag 6, and it has a bunch of sub bags within that bag that we'll start looking at now. And in bag 1 there'll be 3 resistors and an IC socket. And the first component we're going to place is the IC socket, and you just want to hold that in place with a little bit of solder, and then solder all the other legs once you've checked the orientation is nice and straight. And just make sure, like with all the IC sockets, that you've placed this with that little cutout at the top facing the right direction on the silk screen of the PCB. And then we've just got to bend the legs with the forming tool of these resistors, R49, R50 and RLED. And then once you've got them placed, you can solder each of the legs and then give them a snip. And then we're up to sub bag 2. So this has a bunch of components like some more switches and some screws and a potentiometer that we're going to place on the daughter board. And then the first thing you want to do is place the header in the socket that we soldered earlier on the motherboard, and then place the daughter board on top of that. And then you want to screw that in place, and that's going to hold it nice and tightly in place while we then solder the header of the daughter board to the actual daughter board itself. And then once you've completely soldered that header to the daughter board, you can unscrew the screws we put in earlier, and then we can work on the rest of the daughter board on its own. And then we have to put these caps on these switches. And as I said, these were really difficult to do. And if you're just trying to push them on the cap, it's a bit difficult. So what I did was just push them into the table with the cap on the table. And that seemed to be the quickest and easiest way to get these caps on these switches. And then you've got to place the switches on the board. And same old trick, just solder one of the legs while you hold it in place. Then check the orientation, and then solder the rest of the legs. And then after those 2 switches, you need to do this little bracket, and there's just a little leg there to solder. It's not connected to anything though. And then you need to solder in this trim pot, and the trim pot is the same as with like the capacitors. Just solder a leg in place, and then check its orientation, and then solder the other legs. And that trim pot will be used later to calibrate the LEDs. And then we just have to do the third and final switch for the daughter board, and just hold it in place, solder one of the legs, check the orientation, then solder all the rest of the legs. And then next up we've got to do sub bag 3, which is basically all the components for the LEDs that will go onto the solder board. So first you just want to sort these parts out, but it's pretty simple stuff. And then we can go ahead and attach this header to the LED board, and you want to make sure that you solder one of the legs and get it at a nice right angle. And then if it's at a right angle and orientated correctly, you can solder the rest of the legs. And then you can just give the legs on the underboard a snip. And then we need to solder this LED board to the daughter board. So just hold it in place, solder a leg, and then solder the rest of the legs once the orientation is correct. And make sure that your LEDs are going to be facing the same way as the switches. And then we're about to place the LEDs through the LED board, so make sure that you place the LEDs so that the longer positive leads are in the hole marked with the little plus sign there. So you want to make sure that all of these LEDs is orientated correctly, otherwise you're going to have a few issues. So just be very careful and place them in the right direction. And then you want to get out bag 9 and get out the hex key and some faceplate screws. And what we're going to do is place some tape over the LED light holes on the faceplate, and then attach the faceplate to the daughter board to then get those LEDs to be sort of stuck in place with that tape there. And then you just need to solder all of those LEDs in place, just being very careful because they are quite close together. So you just want to make sure you don't cross any of the pins with any solder, and then you can give them a snip and then remove the front panel from the daughter board and then remove the tape. And they should all be nice and flush. And then we just want to solder this ribbon cable, so just hold it in place, solder one of the legs, check the orientation, solder the rest, and then it'll all be done. And then now we just have to attach the daughter board to the motherboard, so plug that header back into place, attach the ribbon cable, and then fasten the daughter board to the motherboard by screwing it into those 3 standoffs that we have there with the screws that we attached earlier. And then you want to get bag 7, and we're going to be taking out all those components and sorting them. And what I like to do is take some of the smaller components and put them in some kind of glass so I don't knock them over and lose them on the floor. And then you want to get these 2 Opto LED PCBs and break them apart. And you need to file down the edges to make sure that they're nice and smooth and round so we can put them on the board and that they will complete the Opto circuit correctly. And then we have to put these little LED bulbs into those LED boards, and they have to be orientated correctly. And the way to orientate them correctly is there's this little flat edge on the LED lights, and that lines up with the flat kind of edge on the LED board. So the flat edge is the negative lead and the rounder edge is the positive lead. So you've got to be very careful with these ones and make sure they're lined up correctly. And then you can just hold them in place, add a bit of solder to one of the legs, check the orientation, and then solder the other leg once you're sure it's in place, and then snip the leads. And then it's just rinse and repeat for the second LED. And then you've got to place these 2-pin sockets. So you can just hold them in place again and then solder one of the legs and then check the orientation, make sure they're nice and straight, and then solder the other leg. And then we've got to place the standoffs. So you want to screw in the 4 standoffs for each Opto from below the motherboard and make sure that you place a washer between the motherboard and the standoff. And then you've just got to place the black Opto tubes over the LED PCBs. And then we need to place the light dependent resistors that are labeled 1 and 2. And you should note that 1 goes on the bottom and 2 goes up the top. So 1 is for the compression circuit and 2 is for the LED light circuit. And then after you've put the headers in, you can place the Opto PCBs over the LDRs and the 2-pin headers, and then screw each of those into the standoffs. And then you want to push up the 2-pin headers so that they are flush with the bottom of the PCBs. Then solder and trim the leads for the headers and the leads for the light dependent resistors. And then you can just label the Optos 1 and 2 to keep track of them in case you ever need to remove them. Then if you're not doing the vintage output, it's time to place the ICs in their socket. And there are 5 of them, so make sure that you line up the notches or circles on the ICs with the notches in the sockets. And note that IC3 faces the opposite direction from the rest of the ICs. And then you just need to snap the female end of the ribbon cable into the header of LA2A. And then that's the end if you're only doing the modern version of the OLA5. If you're doing the vintage version, we're now going to go on to do the installation of the op amp and the output transformer. And then in another video, I'll show you how to calibrate the OLA5 and the LEDs and all that sort of stuff. So first up, you want to take out the components that are in the vintage output package. And besides the output transformer, there are 3 resistors and 2 capacitors. One is this big tantalum capacitor and the other is the smaller ceramic capacitor. And you first want to place the small capacitor, the small ceramic one, at C23. And then you want to make sure you get the 15K resistor for R47 and the 8.8K resistor for R48. And we're not going to need the 2.7K resistor that's used in the EQP5 equalizer kit, not the OLA5. And then once you've placed those components, you can flip the board and solder them in place. and then give the legs a snip. And then we just have to place the tantalum capacitor, and it's valued at 220 UF, and it's a big one, so you shouldn't be able to mistake it. And basically you can see the plus sign on this capacitor, and that has to line up with the plus sign on the main PCB board. Just make sure you get that right, because like the electrolytic capacitors, it is polarized. So just make sure that plus sign lines up. And then once you've got it orientated correctly on the board, you can solder it in place. And then before we put in the output transformer, we're actually going to sort out the op amp. And the first thing you want to do is put all these little sockets into place, and then we're going to solder them to the motherboard. And to keep them in place, you can use some tape just to hold them down, and then flip the board over and then solder them. And then in the red 25 op amp bag, you'll have these little pins, and they're going to go into the sockets we just soldered. And you should just note that the ground pin socket will be left empty for the R25 op amp. And then you want to place that red 25 circuit board over the pins and solder them. And it's recommended to wait 30 seconds between soldering each pin so that the previous joint can dry. And then once all the pins are soldered, you can remove the whole op amp assembly from those sockets. And then there's these two resistors that we have to place in the op amp board. So you just want to bend the leads of those resistors and place them in the R11 and R12 positions. And they're not polarized, so you don't have to worry about their orientation. And they're both the same value, so you can place them in either spot. And then once they're placed, you can solder them and trim the legs. And then next we have to place Q1 and Q2, these smaller transistors. And you want to make sure that you orientate the transistors according to the outlines on the circuit board. So those little semicircle shapes need to match with the semicircle of the transistor body. And as you did with the resistors, bend the legs against the bottom of the PCB, and then just solder and then trim the leads. And then the last thing we need to do with this op amp is place Q7 and Q8, which are these two power transistors. And BD139 needs to go into Q7, and BD140 needs to go into Q8. And you need to make sure that they go in the exact right spots. And then you want to place them both with the text side facing the Q1 and Q2 transistors that we just soldered in the board. And before you solder them, double check that you've put BD139 in Q7 and BD140 in Q8, and that they're facing the right way towards the transistors. Once you're sure of their orientation, you can solder the legs and then give the legs a snip. And then once you've finished that op amp, you can put it aside, and we're going to move on to adding the transformer to the main circuit board. And then you just want to place the transformer and measure the leads, and we're going to measure about 38 millimeters. But if you're not sure, on the longer side of measurements, so then you have enough lead to place them in the board. And then you want to strip off about 3 millimeters of the insulation and then tin each of those leads. And I like to use these front facing strip tools. They make it very, very easy to trim the insulation off leads like this. And then you just need to place the transformer and fasten it to the board with the included screws, nuts and washers. And then you just need to place the leads of the transformer through their respective holes. The grey and violet holes will remain empty. You just bend the leads against the bottom of the PCB, then flip the PCB over and then solder and trim the leads. And then that's the final installation for the transformer. All we have to do left is place the op amp in its sockets and push them down until you feel those leads snap into place. And then you just need to fasten the front panel via the screws and potentiometer nuts and washers. Then place the knobs, and you want to turn all the pot shafts to the 12 o'clock position, which is about 10 D-tenths from full clockwise or counterclockwise. And then place the knob over the shaft so the white indicator line points to the middle of the top position. Then fasten the knob with the included hex wrench. And then you're all done. That's the end of this build. So that's the third and final build for the OLA5 Opto Compressor from DIY Recording Equipment. It's an amazing sounding opto compressor, and I've actually been using that compressor. I'm just diving into the real capabilities of it now, and the results have been really incredible. I'll definitely have some videos on this soon. And in the coming weeks, I'm gonna have a very special video on a clever way to kind of improve on the build design on this 500 series compressor as well. So thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I'm Mitch from the DIYRecordingstudio.com. I'll catch you soon.